Today we're going to consider a lesson from the book of Ecclesiastes, a great book that deals with the writer's search for meaning and fulfillment in life, search for satisfaction, if you will. The author of Ecclesiastes refers to himself as the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. That's in the very first verse of Ecclesiastes, and again in verse 12 of that first chapter. When we read the word preacher, that translates the Hebrew word kohelet, and we may just choose to refer to him as the preacher or as kohelet, but many Bible students believe that this was in fact Solomon who wrote Ecclesiastes, and that may well have been the case. Others believe the writer was someone else, but who still spoke as if he were Solomon. But in any case, he was a man who was armed with great advantage, and he uses that advantage to engage in this search. We could very well call it a royal search. He has whatever the world has to offer him within his reach. He has immense resources, and he is unequaled in wisdom. And so he puts forth a careful, studied effort to discover the meaning and purpose of life under the sun, as he puts it. And yet, what does he find? Well, the summary as he begins the book is found in chapter 1, verse 13. And here's what he says. He says, "I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that has been done under heaven. It is a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted." So here's what Kohelet found. God has given us this sense of restlessness. By God's design, we as human beings are driven not just to live, but to try to understand the meaning of life itself. We're not content just to exist. Perhaps this is what he means when he says that God has put eternity in our hearts. But he also says it's a grievous task. It's an unhappy business in this search for meaning in life. What he ultimately finds is that life is all vanity. It's striving after wind. And in other words, by our own observations, we can find no meaning and no purpose in life. Certain things are just beyond our control, including man's flawed character and also the perplexing circumstances of this life. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. But the process that the preacher goes through to try to answer his questions involves various things that he experimented with in his life, things that he sampled, if you will. And so the first thing that he tells about is his search for wisdom. So he says in verse 16, "I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain." In this section of the book, we see that wisdom is, in fact, the best thinking that man can do on his own. It's a splendid thing, in fact, as far as it goes. He says in verse 13, chapter 2, verse 13, "I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness." That being said, this search for wisdom does not provide the ultimate answers to our perplexing questions about life. And this is not just wisdom as a means for getting things done that he's talking about here, things like skills or practical wisdom. He seems to be concerned with ultimate questions in his search for wisdom. He's concerned about truth. And the truth that he finds is this, that nothing on earth is permanent. So there's a sense of disappointment, it seems, in what he thinks that he has discovered in terms of his search for wisdom. And then beginning in chapter 2, we see that he also looks into the pursuit of pleasure. He wants to know, is this the way to find the secret to life? So chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure," he says to himself. "So enjoy yourself." And behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly, until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. If there are no answers through thinking, then the preacher says he will try to find answers through experiencing pleasure, sensual pleasure and frivolity. And he discovers this too is folly. Now he might be referring to just drunkenness and debauchery and other immoral excesses, but he also might be simply referring to the pleasures that would otherwise be innocent. In fact, he says that his heart was guided by wisdom in all that he did. Either way, pleasure will not bring any ultimate satisfaction. And this is what he discovers. And there's a lot for us to learn from that as well. We live in a generation that seems intent on living for the sole purpose of partying and entertaining itself. But soon this loses its luster and fails to satisfy. It seems that we can never get enough of the pleasure and of the efforts to entertain. He says, "For as the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool, and this too is futility." Chapter 7, verse 6. Ultimately, to focus one's attention on the pursuit of pleasure is a self-centered thing. It's selfish. And of course it becomes addictive and increasingly unsatisfying. This is what some have referred to as the paradox of hedonism. That is, the more you search for pleasure, the less of it you find. And this truth Kohelet has discovered. But then the third thing that he pursues is discussed beginning in chapter 2, verse 4, and that is the accumulation of possessions, failing to find life's meaning in physical, sensual gratification. Solomon or the preacher turns to more substantial and useful pleasures, the creating of great palaces and delightful gardens, multiplication of great herds and flocks, and the accumulation of great wealth. Read these verses with me. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. Also I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. Well, look at what he did. I mean, we read this passage, and it's almost like he tried to create a kind of Garden of Eden, didn't he? So here were all these things that he accumulated. For him, we would say life was good, would we not? And he admits that the purpose of all this building was somehow to bring a sense of fulfillment and peace to himself. And again, as he did these things, he says his wisdom remained as he pursued these things. He did find pleasure in the midst of his work. And of course, that's a good thing. There is a certain satisfaction just in good, honest labor, certain dignity involved in that. But he found that when it was all done and he reflected on its ultimate significance, he concluded that this too was meaningless. This too was a vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. So, to summarize then, what did he learn? He kind of provides a summary for this in the second half of chapter 2. And we want to look at this. And he discovers or concludes, first of all, that wisdom does excel folly. But he also concludes that, what use are wisdom and pleasure and possessions if we will not be around to use them or appreciate them? And furthermore, everybody's going to die. Death comes to everyone, regardless of what we have in life, regardless of how much we have, regardless of how wealthy we are. We're all going to die. And he speaks of this. He says, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool die alike. So he says, I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. You see, he says there will be no lasting remembrance. When all is said and done, what have I accomplished when this life is over? And this life will end for all of us, because death comes to all of us. But that's not all that he ponders as he thinks about this. He also realizes that everything that he has done and everything that he has accomplished and everything that he has accumulated, it's all going to be left in the hands of other people, and very likely in the hands of the wrong people. So here's how he says that. He says, thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man get in all his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. A sense of emptiness as he thinks about this. What's the purpose of this? It all seems to be emptiness, vanity, striving after wind. But there's a positive note as he thinks about this, because all of this really begins to lead him to think about what really matters, and what he really understands matters is the real joy that comes just from enjoying the simple gifts that God has given, without trying to get more out of them than what they can give, without getting more out of them than they were intended to give. He says then in verse 24, there is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without Him? For to a person who is good in His sight, He has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner He has given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to one who is good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after wind. Just the simple enjoyment of the things that God has provided, enjoying one's work, enjoying being with his loved ones, and most of all, recognizing that all of this comes from the hand of God. That's what the preacher has learned. So what can we learn? Let me just conclude this by saying that all of this that we think about when we read a book like Ecclesiastes, it just reminds us of, I think, two very important principles that are reinforced for us when we read the rest of Scripture and we read into the New Testament. And the first of these is that however much we try to multiply our possessions or pursue pleasures of life, ultimately our life does not consist in any of these things. That's really not what life is all about. The Bible teaches that work is dignified. There's a dignity in work, in good, honest labor. It's honorable. It's fulfilling to a degree. But it is honorable and fulfilling only when it is done for the right reason. I think the Apostle Paul is thinking of along these lines when he says in Ephesians chapter 4 that we should labor with our hands so that we'll have something to share with the one who's less fortunate, the one who has need. That's working with a purpose, with a higher purpose than simply gratifying ourselves. We also see in the parable that the Lord taught in Luke chapter 12 about the rich fool. And of course he prefaces that story and tells us really the reason for the story when he says to beware and on your guard against every form of greed or covetousness. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. Your life does not consist of your possessions. So to make the point, he tells the story of the man who filled his barns with all of his goods, and he felt satisfied. He said, "Take thine ease. That things are fine." But then in the story, God says to this rich man, "You fool! This very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So do we see the point? And surely we can see how that lesson that the Lord teaches there, it reinforces, it echoes the things that the Kohelet was trying to learn there in the book of Ecclesiastes. Well, the other thing that I think that we learn and are reminded about ultimately is that however much we try to know the infinite mind of deity, of God, we cannot by ourselves. We cannot know that. And it's a recurring theme in this book of Ecclesiastes. For example, in chapter 7, verse 23, Kohelet says, "I tested all this with wisdom, and I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me." And in chapter 8, verse 16, he says, "Even though man should seek laboriously, he will not discover. And though the wise man should say, I know, he cannot discover." Well, the New Testament says the world through its wisdom did not and cannot come to know God, there in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And in Romans 11, the Apostle Paul says that the ways of God are unsearchable. They're far above us. They're far above man, and we cannot know them by our own efforts, by our own intuition, or through any other means. True wisdom, you see, is not of this world. True wisdom comes down from God. James talks about that in the New Testament in chapter 3. But I'm also reminded of another Old Testament passage, and that's in Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 20. And there, the writer says that wisdom and power belong to God. Wisdom and power belong to God. He says that God gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. And then he says, it is He who reveals the profound and hidden things. Well, the good news is we can know the mind of God. We can know the things, the deep things of God, but only through God revealing them to us. Only by submitting ourselves and giving ourselves to the things that God's revealed to us in His holy word. So a reminder to us in this is that true wisdom will only come to those who humbly confess their ignorance and foolishness. If we can be humble enough to recognize that we have to depend on our Maker, and we have to depend on our Maker for everything, including true wisdom, then true wisdom can be found because God has made it available to us. This is what the preacher found. This was his quest, and it was humbling to him. And while we struggle in vain to penetrate the mind of God, the irony, in fact, I think the good news is that God has revealed Himself to us through His beloved Son and imparts wisdom to us in His Word. Thank you for joining me again, and God bless.